there's a lot to be said for being the final contestant. So, and it's great to see so many people here as well. I think most people are fairly exhausted by now, or else got drenched. So I'm very pleased to see you all here. I thought I'd just say a little bit about how I came to write, how I came to start writing, particularly these two books which deal with sort of Ireland and Jewish history combined. They're both set in the Second World War. I myself was a war baby, one of a generation born in Britain during the Second World War. I'm sure I'm not the only one around. But war babies, however young, were stamped for life with these very vivid and frightening memories of air raid sirens and running to the shelter and the unforgettable threatening sound of bombers and later V-1s and in particular pilotless rockets, V-2s. But growing up in London after that and learning what was then the very recent history of the Holocaust and the Second World War, I began to realise how lucky I had been, sheltered from far more horrific events. But for an accident of geography, I was aware, and the fact that the Nazis didn't occupy Britain or Ireland, my sister and I would have been among the 1.5 million Jewish children of Europe who died at the hands of the Nazis and the fascists and their collaborators. Died of hunger and disease in the ghettos, the boxcars, the concentration camps and the gas chambers. Beneath the surface, I think I was always aware of this aspect of my Jewish heritage. Much later, as a writer and a school librarian here in Dublin, I started writing aiming to attract young readers with stories set in Ireland to which they could relate, and also to try and entice reluctant readers into the pleasures of reading. But then I learnt that Jewish refugee children escaping the Nazis on a kinder transport had found a haven on Mill Isle Farm in nearby Northern Ireland during the war. And I realised that I could try, in a historical novel based very closely on fact and close to home, to communicate, especially to young Irish readers, something of the dreadful end to which anti-Semitism and racism led not so long ago. During my year or so of research for the first book, Faraway Home, I travelled to Northern Ireland frequently and I visited the farm, Mill Isle Farm, which is an idyllic setting on the Ards Peninsula overlooking Strangford Lough. And I also visited Belfast and the Linen Hall Library. And I was lucky to meet, living in Newcastle, County Down, an elderly lady, a refugee originally from the Sudetenland in what was then Czechoslovakia, who had lived and helped run the farm with her husband. I got great help and information from her and from a local historian in Mill Isle village who had attended the local school, Mill Isle Primary School, with the former refugees and stayed in touch with some of them. With his help and others' help, I managed eventually to track down the former refugees, now most of them grandparents by the time I got to them. I sent them a questionnaire and many sent me detailed replies and old photos. Somebody sent me a DVD interview for the Spielberg archive that he did. All sorts of memories. Somebody sent me a map of the farm with all the things on it marked out. And also, most moving of all, was a diary that a 14-year-old girl, she was 14 when she left Vienna, she translated her diary into English, and she had just given it to the Imperial War Museum in London, which is the main Holocaust museum in England. But she very kindly sent me a copy of it. And it was quite heartbreaking because she had an awful lot to deal with. She had a little brother who she felt responsible for, obviously, and her parents were taken away with no warning. And she was also a teenager of 14, which isn't the best of times for even sort of normal experiences of life, or not let alone this. But I found it gave me a real feeling of how some of them personally felt. In that book, I tried to engage readers emotionally, conveying how it felt to live in fear and danger, to be uprooted, separated from family and everything familiar. But I also wanted to show that despite the homesickness and the anxiety about their families of the refugee children, they did learn, with the help of others, both young and old, to make a new life in which there was even room for humour and fun. In the story, the healing power of friendship between young people from different religions and backgrounds transcends the barriers of religion and culture and gives cause for hope to all of them, even in the midst of the horrors of war. That book won the Bristow Book of the Year in Ireland and a Blue Peter Award and a listing in something called Best of the Bunch American Library Association recommendation. And I travelled all over Ireland, north and south after that, speaking in schools and libraries and arts festivals, and also in my grandchildren's schools in New York and London. And it's now used as a class novel very often in many Irish schools. My publishers tell me that it's a crossover read by many adults as well. And it's just gone into a 12th edition. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about that, because it was the first foray for me into historical novel writing. Then lots of people were asking for a sequel. And I dithered about it for some time, but I was very aware that I myself, if I read a book that I really enjoyed, and then somebody said, oh, you must read the sequel. And almost invariably, the sequel was disappointing. And I remember saying, not as good as her first. And I could imagine lots of people saying that. So I didn't actually write a sequel in the end, but I wrote a sort of companion story set at the same time. It doesn't have the same characters, but it's set in World War II, early years of World War II. But with a very different setting, this time here, as Maurice told you, in Portobello. Most of you know here that the Second World War was known here in neutral Ireland, rather euphemistically, as the emergency. These artisans' dwellings, and I think all of you that are here, most of you probably know this, but as a tour guide, I can't resist sort of getting in another bit of information when you've got a sitting audience, that this is one of the original houses, the artisans' dwellings, where most of the refugees from Eastern Europe came to live. And this museum is actually two of those houses. Originally, just one half of it was the synagogue that they made upstairs in their houses, because they went to Adelaide Road. These came from Eastern Europe in the early 1900s. They were Yiddish speaking, they were very poor, bewildered, and they'd had terrible journeys, and they were invited to go by the existing Jewish community, which was very settled, to Adelaide Road Synagogue on their first Shabbat. And it wasn't a happy experience, I'm afraid, for them. I don't mean to criticise in any way Adelaide Road Synagogue, which is a wonderful shul, but for them, they really, it was so unlike what they were used to. They only had their raggedy clothes still, and they said the davening wasn't the same as it was in their own shul, because mostly in the shtetl, where they mostly came from, the shtetl, but in the middle of each shtetl mostly there was a small wooden synagogue, and that was their shul, and they ran it and they saw to it. And here they went into what my husband's late father called the Englische shul, the word for Adelaide Road. So the intentions were very good to invite them there, but what they did was mostly they made these little synagogues, or stieblach, a stiebel is really what it's called in Yiddish, upstairs in their houses or in small little units in this whole area of Portobello. And this was in the heyday when there were a very large number of Jewish people in this area, and it was called Little Jerusalem. But anyway, in the heyday there were about 8 or 9 of those small synagogues. And in these synagogues they could conduct it as they wanted, they could pray as they wished, they could run it on a shoestring, and that suited them better. And they wanted to be together as well. So that's really why they were in those small synagogues. But this is the only remaining one. It's the only remaining shtibel of all that time. The others have kind of disappeared one way or the other. So I'm glad that we still have this one here. When I started writing about the area, I was interested particularly in the fact that the Jewish immigrants lived here side by side with mostly Catholics and a few Protestants. And all were poor. And I was interested to see how they'd got on. I mean, I didn't come here, I better say this quickly, till 1960. So I'm not sort of an eyewitness of the, of close up of these earlier years. But I could see that it wasn't going to be easy, because the Christians were more used in Ireland to emigrants rather than immigrants, and the Jewish refugees, struggling with a new language and new customs and a new life, were also hard pressed. As in Faraway Home, friendship between young people across the divide is one of the themes in 17 Martin Street. In addition, the thorny subject of Irish neutrality in the Second World War is very relevant and comes into both books. I interviewed former residents of both persuasions, and as I say, my late father-in-law was a very important part of my picture of the way a lot of those immigrants were. And in the story, he's known as Zeta. I managed to get into one of the houses in Martin Street with some difficulty. I went to Martin Street because I decided that was where I was going to set. It was based on true events, but I wanted to pick the part of Portobello, that would appear to be most relevant. So I found Martin Street right in the heart of Portobello, and with what looked like very little change. I mean, obviously the district has changed enormously now, but even then, when I started writing this, there were changes. But anyway, Martin Street looked much as it must have looked. So I walked up and down, and then I thought, I must try and get into one of these houses, because in the museum, of course, it's hard to tell, apart from the little kitchen down below, which I used as material. The house, obviously the houses are the two houses have been knocked together and is configured totally differently. So I thought, I can't really knock on a door and say, I'm writing a book about this street, can I look at your house? I thought, I can't really do that. So I walked up and down for a bit, and then I noticed there was a discreet for sale sign at one end, near one end of the road. And I went up, and I felt a bit guilty because I obviously wasn't planning to buy the house. And there was a woman outside, and she had lovely colour pictures of 17 Martin Street. And I said, is it all right to just come in and look over the house? And she said, oh, yes, yes, and she gave me a leaflet. So I went in, and it was fascinating. It gave me a huge jump in the book, because in the book the non-Jewish family are there already and the Jewish family move in next door. So I wanted to have the Jewish family, there were 2 girls and a baby, and have them running up and down the stairs excitedly and sort of looking at everything. And after that visit, I could, and I got as close as I could with all the details, from the tiny parlour to the outside privy in the backyard, to make sure they were truly authentic. Actually, many of my readers have been quite shocked by the idea of the privy, even though it was in 1940. In the story, which is, as I say, based on fact, Ben Byrne, the Catholic family's mother, is ill with TB, which was a scourge in Ireland at that time. A Jewish family, the Goldens, move in next door, and Hetty Golden's father sews buttonholes for a living, but has a weakness for gambling, while Ben's dad worries about his ailing wife, but has a weakness for drink. There is conflict between the two families, but eventually differences are overcome through joint efforts to help a young Jewish female refugee, who's called Renata in the story, who was on the run from the very strict Irish immigration authorities, whose job it was to prevent any refugees before, during and even after the war from entering the country, unless they have and there were very few of them, full papers and full documentation. And even then it was extremely difficult. Ranata's true story, complete with the extraordinary twist at the end, was told to me by the elderly lady herself, and I noticed that she was interviewed in Louis Lenton's heartbreaking film No More Blooms, which some people here might have seen, about Ireland at the time of the war. And it was interesting to see her there, and she was the person that gave me the story as well. For the book, I interviewed former Portobello residents of both persuasions. I found a house with 3 old Protestant ladies who'd lived in the same house since their birth, and they were kind of in their 80s, all 3 of them. And they gave me a very interesting picture of the way it used to be, and then what it was like when the refugees came in, and they were quite nice about it. And it was a bit of an insight. The Jewish people that I didn't have any problem at all, because in the community there were many, many people who had grown up, or whose families had grown up in Martin Street, so there was no problem there. But I did a few other things in the research. I visited strange places like nearby Sing Street Christian Brothers School to identify the school uniform that Ben, the young boy, Catholic boy in the story, would have worn when he bumps into Hetty in the street. So I had to identify the uniform, not just that they're wearing at the moment, but I'm very careful about details, so I had to suss out what the uniform was in the 1940s. So in the end, lots of people passed me on from one person to another, and eventually I met the principal, and he'd had to look it up too, but he gave me the details. And he said, let me know about the book, but I didn't get round to it. I also went to the Transport Museum to check on the trams that were in use at the time, and a former TB sanatorium in County Wicklow, now a care home. I went to the newspaper archives to get details and photos of the notorious Dublin bombing. One of the aims of 17 Martin Street was to try and recreate for younger readers the relationships and some of the vibrancy, the customs and the local colour of Little Jerusalem, which still existed, as I say, up to a point when I arrived in Dublin in the 1960s. It gradually faded as the generations of immigrants moved on, most of them upward and away from Portobello. From my research, I found that although in early years there was occasional resentment and suspicion between the residents of Portobello, yet in the long run, affectionate, warm and often very long-lasting friendships were formed across religious lines. The area, with alterations, has now become a very desirable residential area, with one shop only surviving, and that's the Bretzel Bakery, as all of you, or most people here would know, in Lennox Street, which still supplies kosher bagels, challahs, and rye bread to the Jewish community. I thought I might read you a little bit out, if that's okay, and then if you've got any questions, you can ask me then. I'm just reading the bit from Martin Street. There, yes, this is Ben and his friend, and an incident that sparks off a whole series of results in the story. Come on, Ben, Billy's doing a message in Clanbrassil Street, and then we're going to try out the football he got from his uncle. It was a holy day, school was closed, and Ben's pal Smiler was at the door with his neighbour Billy Flynn. Go on with you, Ben, it's time you got out, his grandmother said. She gave them each a freshly baked jam tart, and off they went, picking up Maurice Wolfson, known to everyone as Mixer, further along the street. The boys walked up the South Circular Road, busy with horse-drawn carts and bikes, and into bustling Lower Clanbrassil Street, lined with kosher bakeries and butcher shops, along with watchmakers, grocers, drapers and wine cellars, and dairies. Billy and Smiler couldn't resist bouncing and kicking the new ball all the way up the noisy street through a heaving mass of people, and from all sides, breathing in the tempting smells of pickled cucumbers, spices and hot bread. Mixer darted into Weinronk's bakery and emerged grinning with 3 bagels, marked down because they were yesterday's. Ben munched the delicious bagel. He loved these round bread rolls with the crispy onions and poppy seed on the top. And turning into Lombard Street, they started an impromptu game with a new ball and were soon joined by local children. Ben received one of Billy's famous headers and gave an almighty kick, which Mixer, running, tripped and missed. And as they watched in horror, the ball zoomed on to hit a white-haired old man who just emerged from Rubinstein's butcher shop on the corner with a newspaper-wrapped parcel under his arm. Then, bouncing off him and knocking him off balance, the ball hit the plate glass window and smashed to smithereens. "Run!" shouted Billy, and they all sprinted off down Lombard Street. But Ben had never been a fast runner, and after a couple of minutes, breathless and terrified, his glasses slipping down his nose, he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Just my luck," he thought miserably as the guard marched him back to the shop, crunching over the shards of glass on the path. And there stood the old man, dazed but upright, still clutching his parcel. Only then did Ben realise who he was, the grandfather of the Jewish family who had moved the night before into the house next door, and he'd spied through the window them sitting around the table with 2 candles in high candlesticks. His heart fell. Okay, now only reading that because it gave a description of the of life of Clanbrassil Street and the way it all was. But actually that's an inciting incident, as they say, which set off a whole series of events, and in the end Ben, rather reluctantly, becomes a Shabbos goy for the family next door, and various other things flow from that. So just to finish off really about when the people moved out of the latter part of the time in Clanbrassil Street and in the South Circular Road, these Eastern European immigrants scrimped and saved primarily to get their children an education. And some later became chemists, like Harold Mushat, who was one of the founder members of this museum, and there's a photograph of him down below. Some became jewellers, dealt in wood and laminates like the Noiks, furriers, craftsmen, antiques. There's a picture of Cohen's Antiques in Liffey Street down below. And later, lawyers, scholars, doctors, dentists, and even politicians. Downstairs, as you go in on the left to the museum, well actually no, this part's on the right, you'll see some of the what they went on to do, and it's quite a wide range apart from these that they achieved. And then, you know, that this was what they came for primarily, I mean, to avoid some of the horrors of the Tsarist Empire, of the pogroms, of the Cossacks marching in, galloping into to a shtetl, with their sabres, slicing around with their sabres, shining, and yanking any young boy that was around 14 or more for the service in the Tsar's army, which was some of the things they'd come from. That was one of the many things. Also, there was a great poverty in the shtetl, really in Eastern Europe as well. And they were determined when they came that their children were going to have a better life than they had. And that's what they achieved. And it wasn't easy for them, but I'd say they would have been delighted if they'd known. I don't think they'd have been sad that people left Clanbrassil Street. I think they would have been delighted that they moved on to better houses and better places and a proper life, and to be able to have families. I think they would have been very pleased with with the hard struggle that they went through. Yes, oh, should I just say best wishes? Best wishes, yeah. Because a German friend who came to